So today, we're going to dive deep into a really compelling analysis of coronavirus research done by a top Chinese military scientist, Brigadier General Yusen Zhou. We're going to unpack the science, we'll look at the timeline, and the strategic military context surrounding his work, all based on the information laid out in the source documents.
And this work really brings us to the central question that's at the core of our investigation today. For a top military scientist working right at the forefront of virology, what exactly did he discover? And, what was the ultimate goal of his research?
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into the scientific foundation. Then we'll look at the, let's call them anomalous or unusual aspects of this project. From there, we'll zoom out to the bigger strategic picture, see how all these lines of evidence come together, and then finally, we'll explore the critical questions that are still hanging in the air. Okay, so our first pillar of evidence is the science itself. To really get the significance of this work, we have to start with the very specific part of the virus that General Zhou's team focused on. It's a tiny but absolutely critical component called the Receptor Binding Motif, or RBM for short. So what is the RBM? Well, think of it like the very tip of a key. It's the one exact part of the virus's spike protein that has to physically connect with our cells to, unlock the door and kick off an infection. It is the absolute point of first contact. Now, this diagram here shows why the RBM is kind of a double-edged sword. Because it's so essential for the virus to infect us, it also happens to be the perfect target for a vaccine. General Zhou's earlier work on MERS and SARS basically concluded that the best way to get a protective immune response was something called immunofocusing, basically training the immune system to zero in on this one single critical spot. But, and this is a big but, targeting the RBM can come with a hidden danger, a really serious complication where the immune system, while it's trying to protect you, gets tricked into attacking your own body. So this diagram illustrates a dangerous mechanism called molecular mimicry. Here's how it works. First, the immune system gets trained to attack a specific sequence on the virus's RBM. But here's the problem. A protein in our own central nervous system, called neuron 4, happens to share a very similar structure. So this can lead to what's called autoimmune cross-reactivity, where the immune system just gets confused and tragically attacks the protective sheath around our own nerve cells. And that could potentially cause serious neurological damage. All right, so let's move to our second pillar and see how this all starts to build. We're now shifting from the general science to the specific project itself, General Zhou's SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. And as you're about to see, several features of this project are described in the source material as being, well, highly unusual. Let's start with the timeline, because it raises questions right away. The patent was filed on February 24th, 2020. Now, if you work backward from Zhou's own 4-month benchmark for a previous MERS vaccine, that suggests a start date sometime in the fall of 2019. But what's maybe even more telling are the animal model logistics. You see, the project needed aged, humanized mice, and generating a specific group of mice like that takes a lot of lead time. According to the source, this pushes the likely start of the project all the way back to August 2019, at the latest. And it's not just the timeline that's raising eyebrows, it's the actual design of the vaccine. The construct included a specific sequence known as RGD, which is a big deal for a couple of reasons. First, it hadn't been seen in other related coronaviruses. And second, as you can see here, it binds to a totally different type of human cell receptor called an integrin. The source suggests that putting this in points to a pretty sophisticated focus on making the virus better at binding to human cells, maybe even beyond the usual respiratory pathway. And that brings us right to our third pillar, the strategic context. So we've looked at the science and the project specifics. Now we really need to understand the environment this research was happening in, specifically the military doctrine of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA. You see, according to PLA doctrine, the human brain is explicitly identified as a new combat space. They even created a military medical specialty back in 2017 to pursue mental and cognitive dominance. The stated research goals are incredibly direct, including research into brain damage and interfering with the brain, causing brain dysfunction. And this is really where the pieces start to click together.
General Zhou's vaccine patent was co-authored not just by virologists, but by scientists from the Institute of Military Cognition and Brain Sciences. Now, for a respiratory vaccine, that is a highly unusual collaboration. It suggests the PLA was interested in the neurotropic, or brain-affecting properties of new pathogens. And this fits right in with Zhou's own early research, which was some of the first to show high viral loads in the brains of infected mice. So we've looked at three distinct pillars: the science, the anomalous project, and the strategic military context. Now let's see what happens when you put them all together. When you look at it all together, a pretty clear picture starts to form. Pillar 1, the science, which zeroed in on a target with a known risk for molecular mimicry that's linked to a human neurological protein. Pillar 2, the project, with a timeline that suggests a pre-pandemic start and a unique design to enhance how it binds to cells. And Pillar 3, the context, which is a military doctrine that literally views the brain as a combat space, carried out with brain science experts. The conclusion presented in the source document is that all these factors converging points not to a standard vaccine program, but to a sophisticated dual-use research efforts. But even with all this evidence converging, the analysis in the source material still leaves us with several critical, unresolved questions. First off, there's the enigma of General Zhou himself. He died in May 2020, not long after submitting his key study, and his huge body of research just disappeared from public view. On top of that personal mystery, you have official government assessments. The U.S. State Department has raised concerns about China's compliance with the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. And then in 2021, the Department of Commerce actually sanctioned the institute where Zhou worked for using biotechnology to support the Chinese military. Which brings us to our final thought. This entire analysis pieces together evidence from public scientific papers, patents, and doctrinal writings. So the question we're left with is this. Based on the evidence presented, what other secrets are still out there, just hidden in plain sight?